So here's an early edition of a Gemara from the displaced person camps from 1946, just after the war ended. It's really small. It's really delicate. I don't know if the camera will catch this. It's bound and printed on paper that was formerly invoice sheets. So like these are sheets from a business that say in German, sale price, quantity, and they're just taking any paper they can get and they're printing these. And so you open it up and there's this wonderful note from the committee that printed it in Hebrew, just basically saying, here's this we're printing through the American authorities. And then you have, which is my favorite part, the first page of the calendar of the Daf Yomi and Mishnah Yomi following the Holocaust, so that now you can start learning again.
Hello and welcome back to this channel. My name is Frida Faisal, and I'm a Jewish American YouTuber with an emphasis on Hasidic Judaism, the Yiddish language, the Jews of New York, and more. Today, I am sharing with you a very special tour of the Talmud collection of Samuel Marks. Samuel Marks grew up in a secular Jewish family in Boston. He is now a student at the University of Michigan School of Law. He is not a professional Jewish academic or historian. As a young adult, Sam reconnected with his Jewish identity and discovered a deep interest and love for the Hasidic world. He wound up attending learning sessions at a Satmar synagogue in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, getting intimately close to this world, developing a great appreciation for it, but also learning it incredibly deeply. As I understand it, he taught himself to read in all sorts of dialects of Yiddish and Hebrew, and I assume as well Aramaic. And along the way, he became a collector of unique Judaica texts and clothing and other relics. He collected rare artifacts of the early days of Hasidic Jews in America after the Holocaust. He has prayer books, Sepharim, which are sacred books, school texts, and so much more. We talked a bit about this in another video where he showed some of his hats, as well as a particular book from the Yiddish Satmar school from 1977. And I hope we will have another video where he will share some of his early Satmar Rebbe's writings. Today, however, he will give us a tour of his favorite collection, his collection of Talmuds of different times, and he will share the stories they tell. There's so much to this. It's an amazing collection, and I hope you'll stick around for it. As always, I want to thank the channel members for making this work possible. All of your support goes a long way to making this time-consuming project happen. And now for the Talmud tour. So, okay, let's pivot then. How about you share with us what you can tell us about your Talmud collection, which is, I would say, your most prized collection. Would you say that, or you don't rank it?
I'd say so. A lot of them, I have Talmuds going back to the 1600s. The first Talmuds are printed in the 1500s, but those tend to be rare and very expensive, some going for tens and tens of thousands of dollars. So a little bit beyond my budget, but I also have a lot of Talmuds that are not so sought after, but are nonetheless rare. Like behind me there, that's the first Talmud printed after the Holocaust in America in 1947 in Brooklyn. It's the same Talmud that Joel Teitelbaum owned. It's not his copy. His copy is sold for $100,000 at auction a few years back, as you might expect. The one underneath that is a later printing from 1979. Belonged to an old Satmar family that actually were Satmar Hasidim before the war, like one of the rare instances of that. And so it actually has the nameplates inside from them and all that stuff. But some of these bigger modern printings are rarer, and I cherish those actually maybe at times more than some of the original stuff, because I think the original stuff from Eastern Europe is inherently collectible. There's a level of, if someone sees one of these old books with these old leather bindings and these beautiful title pages, they just assume this must be worth something. But like a book printed in Brooklyn in 1947 in this massive format, which is 16 inches tall, it's full folio size. A lot of people have trouble getting rid of them. They're just trying to pawn them off when their Zaidi passes away, unfortunately, and they don't have anywhere to put it. Things like that. The one above actually came from an older gentleman in Borough Park who had an extra set of the old version that he just had on hand. He was just trying to get rid of, that he had lying around as like a spare for study, right? And so a lot of the hunt is more difficult with the modern stuff because they don't have that value, right? So I I'd say they're all treasured, but especially the bigger sets that are modern, that are harder to get in good condition. Sometimes the stuff will come up and it'll be just beat to death, and they'll have what people will call like yeshivish binding, where you basically take tape and you tape over like the ends of the books, and then you take like a white marker and you write, in Hebrew cursive or Hebrew script what the book is, and it's really crude. I don't think I have any with me, but maybe I do. I can look. But it's finding stuff in good condition is also hard. So there's some volumes I'll show you which are in horrible condition, but because of what they are and the era they're from, they're actually unusually good. And so there's a lot of great stuff that I'm excited to show you. A lot of stuff that is, printed cheaply, stuff that's printed beautifully. So there's just a range.
Let's
so
see
in
it.
terms of getting started, okay, I'm gonna go grab it. This is from the 1690s, and I think this is a great place to start for a few reasons. This is a Talmud volume printed in Frankfurt on the Oder, which I believe is about 50 miles southeast of Berlin for your viewers if you're trying to get a sense of where that's located. It's the first Talmud that's a full set printed in Germany. This is Maseches Nida, which is the laws of ritual purity for women, and it's the last volume of the traditionally printed Talmud. I think this volume is good to start with for a few reasons. One is that it really encapsulates a lot of the problems that Hebrew printing faces in Eastern Europe as Jews trying to get copies of books, as Jews trying to finance these books, how that develops and why that's a problem, and why a lot of the problems that exist come up over time. Secondarily, this specific volume has a lot of personality, which I will get into as I show you the volume. A lot of volumes, if I open up the first page here, you'll just notice all these signatures. These are all the prior owners of the book who wanted to basically say, Samuel owned this book in Frankfurt in 1750. Oftentimes these are just names. I'd say maybe majority of the time it's just, Samuel 1750. Close second is going to be Samuel 1750 Frankfurt, where they add the location. And those are really special. So this one, for example, I don't think it's going to come up on the camera, but I will read it to you. It says Berlin, Germany, 1933 in the margin there. And it belonged to, and it says Rabbi Dr. Cohen, and it gives his address, and it tells you where in Berlin he lived. But just as the Nazis are coming to power, someone had this in Berlin. The other interesting stamp in this volume is actually on the next page, which I'll show you in a minute, which is actually for the head of the rabbinic court of Basel, Switzerland from about 1900. And why that's interesting is that Basel was a really anti-Semitic place. There was no Jewish community for years. And he was the one who basically invited Herzl to host the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And he hosted the first Zionist Congress. Now, as a Satmar studier, a Satmar Talmud or student, I'm not that interested in the Zionist connection, but you can at least see how the personality in these books really comes out, where you can see who owned it, who was studying from it, and really the wide range of Jews. You have Orthodox Jews in here, rabbis of towns, doctors, scholars, Hasidim, Misnagdim, so like Hasidim and people who were opposed to the Hasidic movement early on, just a real range of people. And I think that's really fun. Now, this is really cool because you have on the first page here, and I will make sure this gets in frames, this is Rare, which is the title page. This is a copper plate engraving, and it is emblematic of how they printed the Talmud in this era, which is to say that the Talmud was always considered kind of like the holiest printing book, like the most special printing book. It was the biggest endeavor. They would use the best paper, the best type. It was almost a way for the print house to show off and to do a public service. So they would often have these beautiful engravings. Early on, those engravings were actually from Christian books. So they'll just take, for example, and I'll show you in another volume later, pictures of like cherubim, like the fat babies with wings, like Cupid, right? On the first page as you open the book. Things that are not very Jewish images, and I think a lot of Orthodox Jews would take offense at. So sometimes these images on the page, these pages can be rare because people rip them out. Like very pious Jews would rip them out. And so this is interesting because this, you might think looking at it, right? This is Aaron, Moses, David, and Solomon. I don't know if you can read, but those are the four characters.
I
But
see. I can see it.
yeah, at the top you have a lamb with like a ritual hand washing apparatus, and you might think that's a very Christian image, right? Like the lamb above everything else. It's actually not here. That's actually the Jew who funded this was a court Jew in Eastern Europe, or actually no, probably Western Europe, actually Central Europe, who was incredibly wealthy. Court Jews were like Jews who, because of their excellence in finance and lending, would be in the courts of the monarch of a kingdom, and would often provide loan services, administrative services, a lot of things kind of associated with Jews stereotypically. And this was first financed by the most wealthy, powerful Jew in Eastern Europe, or no, sorry, again, Central Europe, who actually ended up in a lot of trouble because he gave huge loans to monarchs for funding their wars, which was a common occurrence in that era, where these Jews had so much money from money lending who were in these positions that they would actually fund full wars, or at least partially fund the wars, cover up the difference for the monarch. And the person who he funded defaults and then blames the Jew for it and says, I won't pay you back. The Jew gets imprisoned. And so they have to find a new sponsor, who's this other Jew, I believe it's Berman is his last name, who is friends with the king of Poland. They're very close. He actually helps the king of Poland get crowned as king of Poland through a lot of court intrigue and things like that. So he's incredibly wealthy, and he's supposedly the lamb. That's what it says there, Berman. I don't know if it's coming through. That
Berman is the lamb?
Yeah, he's the lamb, apparently, because he's the one who funds it. And actually, the central text there basically says this Talmud is funded by Berman, and it's really a nice thank you to him is what this page really is. And it's not really dated. It's just saying in our year, so that as they print each year, they don't have to recut this because it's a really expensive engraving. But I think what's interesting about this is that so early on, right, Talmuds are not an easy thing to print for a few reasons, right? So first things first, you have the first editions, they might be in 12, they're often bound in 12 volumes, but within those volumes are many masechtas or kind of tractates, subject matter book volumes. And within those, there's so much text to edit, incredible amounts of text to edit. You have to go through all these manuscripts. You have to set the type by hand. So you're moving this movable type on the printing press by hand to set it. And it's incredibly labor intensive, and paper is also super expensive. It's not the ink, it's the paper, which is the real problem. To get fine paper for Talmuds is one of the biggest, that and manual labor of setting the type, two biggest investments. And because the Talmud's such a big book, you really have to spend a lot of money. So I believe he invested something like 50,000 Reichsdollars. If you want to get a sense of what that is, 100 years later, a Talmud with inflation is 10 for the whole set. In an early print house who has to bribe their way to get approval to print Hebrew books pays about 100, then 300, then 500, and the 500 to get the approval is considered a ridiculous sum. So 50,000 is crazy money. And he actually donates half of these volumes to yeshivot and poor rabbis who can't afford a Talmud. So that's also why they're rare, is because they were used. And so the Talmud is very expensive, but it's also really contentious because starting off the Talmud, the Talmud historically has been burned and persecuted by Christians starting in, I think, 530, 540, 550. Justinian bans the Mishnah. The common factor going throughout history is often there's a dispute within the Jewish community. Christians have wanted to censor the Talmud kind of continuously, and then this dispute creates an aggrieved party who's willing to crack down on a printer who's printing the Talmud, crack down on a community that has a lot of Talmuds, whatever it may be, who is then going to kind of facilitate that. So when the first Talmuds are printed, the real issue is not necessarily that the church it's not that the church doesn't want to crack down. They just don't have any Hebrew interpreters to do so. And then a dispute arises actually in Venice between one of the main Talmudic printers and a local printer who steals one of his clients basically and prints an edition, and then he undercuts the other with a cheaper edition. Rabbinic authorities gets involved. It's a whole drama, and the Pope finally gets involved and says, we got to burn the Talmud, and they start burning it. There's all these events in history like this where it's really difficult to navigate the Christian kind of framework. Now, coming out of that instance, which happens in the mid-1550s, you get official papal and Catholic kind of guidelines for printing the Talmud, which basically just say remove all the sensitive and kind of banned or offensive information to Christians, right? Now, this volume, Nita, doesn't really have a lot of censorship. Bava Kama and some of like the Bavas have a lot. Sanhedrin has a lot. I can show you some censored editions as we move forward. I have a wonderful censored edition that's not currently with me. I will send you pictures so you can show the audience where you can literally see it's a page of Talmud, but when you open up the text, like half the text is just blank space, like maybe even 75% of the text. There's just a few lines and a ton of blank space, a few lines, a ton of blank space. And that's initially how censorship happened, is you'd have Christians come in and remove the text, the Jewish printers being sneaky and kind of wanting not to censor Jewish study would leave the blank spaces for people to write in the text. And as the Christian censors figure this out, by the mid-1700s, especially into the 1800s, there's no space. And that creates problem too in our modern Talmuds. I have a Talmud from 1980, which still is missing a lot of the censored material because the space was removed. So people didn't recognize, hey, something's missing here. But oftentimes the censored material itself that's being removed are going to be things mentioning Jesus. So like one I can show you later is Sanhedrin, which will have a passage about Jesus that is missing, that basically just calls Mary like an adulterer, right? Which is a common early Christian, anti-Christian kind of polemic that is of the era the Talmud was written. And that isn't in these editions that are modern, printed in New York for Hasidic Jews, and the Hasidic Jews are using, right?
So that line is like totally missing.
Totally missing. If you get an Oz V'Hadar or a Mosnaim Shas, which are like the two common Gemaras you'll find in most Judaica stores today. Like if you go to Borough Park or Williamsburg, they'll have it, but they do different things with it. So like in Mosnaim, they just put it back in the text where they can. And that's kind of difficult because you want to keep the pagination the same, because the earliest Hebrew printers set a pagination that's just been copied over and over again, even though that's not how the Talmud was written, right? Like the manuscript history is largely very vague. Like it's really diverse. So you get Talmuds where different commentaries are in the margin. It's missing a lot of the commentaries that we have today. They might have variants. Oftentimes, the Talmud today has the Mishnah, where the Mishnah will be like the Mishnah Gemara, right? Where like we'll kind of cut up the Mishnah to then correspond to the Talmudic commentary. Almost no manuscripts do that. It's almost always, here's the whole Mishnah and the whole Gemara, and then you have to figure out which goes where. And what they're talking about. So that's a change. Like they make a lot of these small adjustments. The other adjustment that's kind of cool early on is that, if you open the Talmudic page, which will look familiar to most of your, viewers, or, if they're not, they can look online, right? Here's like the average page. The two main commentaries are Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi on the inner margin, Tosfos on the outer margin. And essentially what you get is early editions generally don't have Tosfos, and they especially don't have the Tosfos we have today. Because the Tosfos we have today was set by an early printer in, around 1500, the Sonsino family, who had a blood relation to one of the major Tosafists of the era, whose commentary was not widespread or popular. And so when they compiled the first kind of standard edition of the Talmud for those volumes, they went and found the Tosafot, Tosafot means addition. So it's like discussions about kind of comparative in the Talmud, kind of difficult questions, things along those lines. They went and found their relatives writing. So like, it's almost like if you said, oh, like I'm a descendant of the Satmar Rebbe, and you printed a Talmud and you said, oh, the Satmar Rebbe's commentary needs to be on every page, right? Because he's my great-great-grandfather or something along those lines. That's what he did. And so that's how we get a lot of the same commentaries we have, which are great commentaries, don't get me wrong, but most people don't realize there's a little bit of nepotism going on as to why we read those. But a lot of this, with the early printing, where you're getting into kind of issues of censorship, issues of choosing what you put in and what not, that really takes off post 1550 when the church begins cracking down. It's especially because of the Reformation too. The church is feeling really threatened by heresy and ideas that are dangerous to them. So they want to crack down. Martin Luther's denounced in like 1520, which happens to be, basically when the first full edition of the Talmud's printed in Europe or anywhere in the world on a printing press. So there's a real correlation there that does not sit in Jews' favor. So what happens is there's some guidelines. Again, you expunge the stuff that's not okay for Christian censors, and then you can print it. So when that starts to happen, people are furious, but they have to live with it. And initially, to get to rabbinic approbations, which this actually has the first of a certain type of rabbinic approbation in this edition, which I'll show you in a second, which is a copyright approbation. Earlier on, what those rabbinic like kosher stampings were to say that a Jewish community has reviewed this, and we feel that printing the Talmud in the current form, either we've expunged enough of the stuff that Christians are going to be angry about, or it will be kind of low-key enough, like the environment is kind of calm enough that the repercussions won't be strong. So it's actually about internal preservation. So a bunch of rabbis in Italy come together and say, you need at least 3 rabbis with these certain criteria to approve a Talmudic printing. And if you don't, you'll be excommunicated, right, from your community. And that's all about preservation and preventing anti-Semitism, because the Talmudic printings often result in expulsion of Jews from towns. They result in widespread burning of all Hebrew books, not just the Talmud, because most Christians cannot tell this from any other Hebrew book, right? They just see Hebrew books. And so, for most of the early history, a lot of it's about self-preservation. This Talmud is one of the first to kind of start bringing things back in. So like they're slowly, some of the less contentious stuff they're leaving out still. I don't have any good examples from this volume, unfortunately, to show you, but they're bringing in mostly the small removals. Like there's some pretty egregious commentaries added in the side of the Talmud by the Christian censors that get stuck in it that they can't remove, espousing Christian theology, espousing Christian interpretations of the text. They'll remove, Edomites or mentions of Romans and make them nonsensical, where they might have a pun on the Aramaic or Hebrew, and change it to say something not because they think it's an attack on the church. And they'll just make these corrections that make no sense. Like all heretics become Epicureans. Have you ever heard the term Epicurean? That's kind of where that begins to originate, is that you're getting these censors, all these things like that.
Really?
And so the thing that's interesting, though, is that they're putting things in, but they can't remove the difficult stuff. That's like the key. They can't remove the egregious stuff that will say a Christian interpretation of the text that then is meant to convert. Because when you look at what the censors are doing, when they're removing text and shifting stuff, half the time I'd say it's about, we don't like what they're saying in relation to the church or Christianity or Jesus, etc. Sometimes about morality. They think that this is immoral. Like there's mentions of, I think is it Erevin? It's one of someone can correct me, but one of the tractates that mentions, like a slap in the face to God's cheek, which they find really offensive given their conceptions of Jesus. And basically, a lot of these get removed for that reason, but a lot of things get removed and changed because they're hoping that Jews studying this censored text will convert. And that's a big thing that is new to like the 1500s into this early period of printing. And that's something that's like kind of like what you'd call in the Jewish world a Kiddush, right? Like it's like a innovation that the Christians have invented theologically to kind of justify when they're printing these sometimes. So for this, back to this edition. This is the first edition, though, where we don't see self-preservation as the key reason for the Talmudic printing. This edition is about copyright, because what people begin to realize is that printing a Talmud is not just politically dangerous, it's also incredibly expensive. And so what rabbinic authorities begin to do is they begin to say, listen, we have a shortage of Talmuds. Everyone's too afraid to print them. Christians are burning them. They're really expensive to make. So what we'll do is we'll give print houses exclusivity for a certain period. So, the Dayan of Krakow, the Rabbi of Nikolsburg, all these big Jewish communities in Europe given approbations, you've got 20 years. No one can print another Talmud for 20 years. If they do, they're excommunicated. All these very harsh punishments. And basically what ends up happening is that other people try and print. And, the Frankfurt edition here is actually printed by a university professor who's a Hebraicist with the help of this court Jew and the support of the Jewish communities. So it's more of an intellectual pursuit. So they're not really that interested in enforcing their copyright. But there's a lot of instances where people are dragging other printers to rabbinic court because they say, I have a 20-year exclusivity. It's been 18 years. You can't print this yet. And then people also abusing that, which I can get to in another volume. But so that is the first time that this changes, where it becomes about copyright, and it remains about copyright, I'd say, until like maybe 1900.
Wow.
Sometime very modern, where you start to get less of a concern with copyright, especially with the invention of kind of easier, cheaper printing processes and materials. It becomes less about that. But even up till the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you have really heated, really gross at times copyright disputes where people are making jabs, famous rabbis being called old and senile and things like that because they're supporting a certain edition, or people saying burn the Talmud, which I will get to in another volume, and the next volume actually. But there's another reason I wanted to show you this volume, and which I'm actually going to take me a minute to find it because I don't have a bookmark because these pages are really, really weak, which is that this volume speaks a little bit to the female engagement with Jewish life and Jewish printing, which is something you almost never see. And this was something, I opened the page of this text and it stood out to me. That's weird. And I read it and I was so excited and so happy when I saw this because I said, that is just the coolest thing. And Frida, I think that you might like this as well, which is, so when you printed the Talmud or any of these major print works, oftentimes the printer, they might be children, they might be adults, would get, a little space at the end where they could say on the last page, listen, I'm the one who printed this. The one in this edition, one of the examples that's kind of more plain is like the Horowitz family was involved in printing this Talmud. This is like the son, this is the father, they might have sisters, and they'll just kind of basically say, listen, like this is a major project we were involved in, we're very proud of this. Give us credit now. And it's always the last volume, which was usually Nita. The ordering of the Talmud was not historically what we have it today. So if we get into ordering, brachos was not the first historically. It was after Moed, which is like the holiday tractates. But they changed it to brachos to be first because it was believed to bring blessing onto the printer. So that's actually like a printing segula thing that came about. But this is a probably young teenage girl who is known in printing. She comes up a few times. Her name's Ella. Her father's a convert. They're involved in a lot of the German printing presses. She first comes up in a prayer book where she says, I'm 9 years old. If you see errors in this, just know it was done by a 9-year-old girl. I'm doing my best. Essentially something along those lines. It's really cute. But in this one, she wants a shidduch. She's a little older, and she's saying, I'm on the market for all you boys who are buying this fine Talmud. Know that I set the print. So here it is. It might be hard to see. But there it is. And you'll notice.
I see Ella. I can see Ella.
You see the name Ella. She put her name in big font. That font is bigger than the Gemara itself, like the actual text used for the holy text. She's kind of bold here. And I'll read it to you. So it says, by the hand of, this holy work was done by the hand of Israel, son of Rabbi Moses. May he Shlita, which is like kind of like, may he live like a long and happy, prosperous life. It's like saying he's still alive and may he live for a long time. And on the hand of his sister, the virgin, Ella, the daughter of Rabbi Moses. And then she quotes a passage in Jeremiah, which says something along the lines of a woman will court a man. And that's how she actually tells you what year it is. She's saying the year is, she highlights the letters, which are the year of the book, the book that the book's printed in. So people know this is the year I'm on the market. Usually when printers would print a text like this, they would usually put something related to the topic. Sure, courting a man's kind of related to Nita, but it's not, it's kind of awkward compared to 99% of like the dating where they pick a verse and highlight the letters so that they spell out the date. And it's very clear what she's saying, which is something along the lines of, hey, I'm the daughter of a holy printer. I'm actually engaged in this. Actually, funnily enough, there's a author who's a Swedish writer from the period who goes and sees this Talmud being printed and sees a little girl there setting the type in his book. He just says, there's this like nice little girl there. Like she's like a young woman, right? Sitting there setting the type. And, but basically this is bold, right? Like if you think about like, what do Orthodox Jews think about the role of women? What is Eitelkeit, right? Like this is completely flies in the face of that. It's like she's so bold, she has so much personality, and it's just a really wonderful moment in printing where you get to see the person, not just who read the book, but the person behind the book. And I love these little kind of snippets that go into these types of things. So that's another reason why this volume is like very cherished to me and very treasured. And I only discovered it. I was flipping through the volume and I saw it there, and I just thought, oh my gosh, that's really, because you see the Ella huge, and it's like, this is some very strong, very strong woman who knows what she wants and is very like, you get a sense of who she is, and it's great. I love it. But so yeah, and it also tells you a little bit about maybe how women were thinking about marriage and how bold some women might have been in contrast to what the narrative sometimes is. And I really love that about this volume.
That's a great story.
Isn't it? I just love that.
That's so good. I mean, just imagining her intimate role with the Talmud in the first place is so like gender bendy, or like outside of the traditional confines we imagine that women exist in.
And Frida, we'll get to it, but just to kind of foreshadow a little bit, the Talmud that you see in every yeshiva today, the first edition of it and the second and third were printed by a woman. And she was the one who made it possible. And I'll go into it later, but there's a lot of women in the story in a way that I think most people are not predisposed to expect. So there's a lot of really wonderful kind of women in Orthodoxy kind of viewpoints. You take a microscope to it. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next volume, which is going to get to burning the Talmud by Jews. So this is really interesting. This is a little bit smaller than the last volume, but not by much. This is a Talmud printed in Sulzbach, Germany. It's kind of near Frankfurt on Oder. I think it's in Bavaria, and it's printed in 1750, give or take. And basically, this edition is interesting for a few reasons. First is that it's the first major copyright dispute in the Talmud in history. Because what happened is you have in Amsterdam this print house by the Proops family who print this wonderful, beautiful, very expensive Talmud. And there's a shortage of Talmuds still. There's always kind of early on a shortage of Talmuds. And in Sulzbach, which is kind of like a rebellious print house in some ways, they print some volumes. They're the ones who have a lot of volumes that Jews burn, and I can get into some of the others once we talk about this a little bit. But they decide, why not print a cheaper version so that like young yeshiva boys and rabbis can actually afford it. And they begin printing one in violation of copyright. And all the prominent rabbis of the era get involved. It's this huge ordeal. So this actually is interesting too from a bookbinding perspective, because historically books were not bound when you bought them. You bought them as loose leaves and you brought them to a bookbinder. This one actually has two editions in one. So it has a few track dates from the first edition and then the last track dates from the second. And they're all bound together just kind of in a way where someone clearly bought, it's a lot of the laws about women. So someone clearly just was interested in learning about the laws about women and bought all the track dates and bound them together in one. And it's really wonderful. But it's unusual in that sense, in the sense that you have multiple editions in one, which is more common with the earlier volumes and the later ones. It also has, I talked to you about kind of the Christian imagery in some of these early volumes. If I can just find it here, it has some very Christian imagery, or not Christian, but very non-Jewish, I think would probably be the better way of saying it.
How many images would there usually be in a single Talmud?
That's a really good question. So the first Talmuds had a lot of diagrams. So like the first Talmuds printed in Italy had a good number of diagrams. But immediately when they're reprinted, all those diagrams are left out and they just leave blank spaces. And as time goes by, they reintroduce those diagrams as you print. So a lot of the diagrams that you see, the Talmud I showed you a few minutes ago from the 1600s, that actually has the first reintroduction of diagrams into the Talmudic text itself, where there's not a blank space. I think it's in Eruvin and maybe I think Shavuot, maybe. There's a couple tractates where they begin reintroducing it. And over time, they fill out the diagrams. But in terms of the more decorative aspects of the Talmud, the first editions are really beautiful. In fact, let me show you something here. I have a facsimile of one. This will give you the sense of some of the early decorative nature of the Talmud. The first volumes are kind of plain, and part of that has to do with them being printed by Christians who are generally a little bit more not as excited to make these look beautiful and generally kind of have a more refined taste, just generally as individuals. But this is a facsimile of a 1520-ish Yerushalmi. You can see the first title. Here we go. The first title page, like the first not title page, the first image of the Gemara is huge, even bigger than what you'd see today. There's still, those big, first word is zoomed in, but it's not like today where it's this tinier thing. It's this really elaborate woodcut. And the earliest ones, they'll have like rabbits, cherubs in them, all of these different things that you don't associate with Jewish imagery. And here's like an early title page, right? So the earliest Talmuds, actually, if you remove this decorative border, it's the central text that is all they'll have. It'll just say, what's in it, the commentaries, where it was printed, who printed it, those types of things. And it's really informational. As time goes by, different printers will introduce their own print marks into it. They'll put their initials in. They'll add these beautiful decorative title pages. And they get more and more beautiful, more and more colorful as time goes by. And I have some that are just absolutely gorgeous. I'm happy to show a couple if that's of interest, but there's just a lot of these wonderful images. And as time goes on, things get more elaborate, but you also need to understand that when it comes to printing and it comes to the Talmud, a lot of these printers you're spending a lot of money. They don't have money to go out and make Jewish images. So like the first Talmud, I think I may have mentioned earlier, just takes a wood carving from Aesop's fables, right? And uses it in the Talmud, or they'll take it even from one of the famous ones uses from the 1500s, uses actually a woodcut that was originally designed for a text denouncing the Talmud and explaining all the evils in the Talmud. And they used that same woodcut and they used it for the decorative aspect. So there's kind of a sense that, at least in terms of images, because of the climate of Europe at the time, I think in part because of the resource management aspect of it, that these images are kind of a little bit more tolerated. And as time goes on, they become a little bit just increasingly less. I don't know if you can see this. So this is like the page saying who's giving permission. And you can see the little cherubim, the little cupids, right? And also here too, this is the decorative aspect, right? You have this nice decorative cut, but you get these kind of less than Jewish images, like those cupids. I have a Talmud from 1735, 40 that has, actually, when you look at this front page here, when you look at the first word of the Talmud, where it begins the Mishnah with the first word, right there in that big, beautiful decorative piece, there's actually a face. There's a face staring back at you. There's like an image of just like a cartoon face staring back at you. This is completely decorative, but very un-Jewish. And so that's very cool. But getting back to why this Talmud is kind of cool from a copyright and Jews printing it perspective, as I mentioned earlier, there's this Amsterdam edition. It's really expensive and this cheaper one. The debate really comes down to, is it okay to print this cheaper version so that people can have access to it? Or is it more important to preserve the Amsterdam copyright? The first rabbi to come out on this is this Polish rabbi who says, completely illegal, burn it. And so people start burning it. So the Jews begin to burn this copy. And in other parts of Eastern and Central Europe, like in Germany, where this print house is based, they say, no, this is totally fine. And you get often what you get in these debates are the regional rabbis who are local to the print house saying it's fine. The regional rabbis to the other print house that has the exclusivity will say, nope, that's totally wrong. And in this instance, they even will go as far as to say, not only will you be excommunicated if you buy this Talmud, but if you have the opportunity to stop someone from buying or selling the Talmud, and you don't take that opportunity, that is itself a violation. So it gets really contentious. It's more cheaply printed, but it's beautiful text still. It's a wonderful little volume, but it's really special in part because you have that copyright story, right? And it goes back and forth. They keep going to different rabbinic courts. Eventually they mediate at like a central rabbinic court where they settle it. The Sulzbach house that's printing the kind of cheaper copyright infringing version pays for the losses, and which is a common settlement in these cases. And but it gets real contentious, and it's the first time it gets really contentious, and these questions need to be addressed. So a lot of rabbis actually begin writing about this. So like the Hassam Sofer has a whole section where he just outlines the nature of copyright in Jewish law and what his position is. And, it's really interesting because oftentimes what it comes down to as well is, are editions available for people to have? Are we dealing with a shortage, or what's the situation on the ground? And so that's a special volume from that aspect. So the modern Talmud, as we know it, comes out of a printing dispute. And it's actually, oftentimes people attribute it to Hasidic, non-Hasidic tensions. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but there's some aspect of that going on, which is that the first, in the early 1800s, there's a Hasidic print house that's opened by the son of I think Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, or one of the founding Hasidic rabbis of the Hasidic movement, who's a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, who is kind of considered the founding figure, the founding father of the Hasidic movement. Like, where if you have a connection to him, you're royalty already. And so basically, his grandson his son opens a print house and begins printing Hasidic works. And basically what ends up happening is that the Baal HaTanya, who's the first Rebbe of Chabad, says, we need a really good Talmud. I'm going to fund it. He funds it. He gets, I think, 5/6 of all the proceeds that come out of it. And they print this Talmud, which has approbations from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, from the first from Levi Yitzhak of Barditchev, who's a very early famous Hasidic leader, a lot of very famous Hasidic leaders. So these full Talmuds are the most expensive ones on the market, except for the first edition, which is rare like hen's teeth, that was printed in Venice in the 1500s. But this is the most expensive attainable copy for a collector. And these frequently go for $150,000 to $500,000, just the general range. One with a shell through it from the Israel-Palestine wars over the years, that was in the line of Israel, just sold, I think, for $170,000, where the whole artillery shell went through it and put a hole right through it. And to give you a sense of the way Hasidic book tradition begins to develop, the family that owned it said the only reason that shell didn't detonate and kill us all was because of the holiness of this Gemara, right? And so it begins to take on this Kabbalistic sense, and this is a very holy Gemara. What ends up happening, though, is that they have a copyright, as anyone does, and the problem is that they, 15 years in, they only maybe have like a few copies remaining in stock. People just can't access them. So in Vilna, there's a print house that basically says, listen, people can't get Talmuds. We're going to, they're out. Their expiration's about to, their copyright's about to expire. Let's just start printing. And it creates chaos. Their rabbis, the print house, it's a Hasidic print house, is freaking out. They're getting all these really strong rabbinic denunciations of that print house. You have a lot of famous rabbis who are Lithuanian coming in defense of the Vilna print house. It gets really, really heated in a way that you start getting ad hominem attacks between the rabbis on both sides. You open up some of these early editions and they're just pages of approbations, right? Of like the rabbis saying this is why. Unfortunately, I don't have one with me, but they're these wonderful editions. And what happens in the end of it is the Hasidic house gets closed. It's not because of people often say it's because of this debate. And what actually happens is, as this debate's ongoing, as both sides are printing an edition of the Talmud, a Catholic or Orthodox priest, I'm not sure, it's in Russia, basically comes out and denounces this print house because one of the employees commits suicide of the print house. And they denounce the evils and like all the blood libel things about this print house.
It was not a Jewish employee.
I believe he was non-Jewish, but I'd have to double check, but I believe so. And what happens is the family that owns the print house is arrested. They're sent to Siberia. Hasidic tradition dictates that they should have been killed, but divine intervention came in and sent them to Siberia instead, which was kind of a death sentence in a lot of cases, but they survive. They weren't supposed to, really, if you know a little bit about the history of how that happened. But basically, Vilna finishes their edition. The Hasidic house in Slavita does not. Now, the Russian government begins to crack down and says, enough of this Jewish printing stuff. We don't like this anymore. And they limit how many print house licenses there can be. And so Vilna gets one. And when these brothers are released from prison, they're the grandchildren of the original founder of this print house. They get the other. And they start printing, again, rival Talmud. So this is the Vilna edition from once they kind of settle their differences and realize that printing and attacking each other is not a good idea. And I like this edition for that reason, because I don't know. Some of the attacks in some of these early volumes are just so gross at times that I
Yeah.
prefer these. So this is an
Yeah.
1860 Vilna edition, and the title page will look familiar to, I'm sure, some of your viewers. It's an earlier edition of what came to be the title page of the Vilna Shas. It's a little bit more primitive. You can see the lions
Beautiful.
there. You can see where a lot of the motifs come from as they kind of evaluate it and make it better. Another thing that's cool in this edition is, you can see the censors approval that basically is just saying that the censor. I think it's in Russian, or the other volume I have is in Ukrainian. I don't know these languages that well. I have family who can translate for me, who help. But basically, you can see the censorship at work here. You can see all that. What's also interesting here is that I don't know if you can really quite see it, but there's a correction where on the side, let me see if I can point it out to you. There's like a little penned in word where they forgot a word in the commentary, and the person corrects it. So you can see like the hand correction in these. But this is the Vilna edition as it starts out, really, and kind of what is closest to what we recognize as the Vilna edition. On the other hand, we have the Hasidic edition here, which is the Holy Zhytomyr edition, which is printed by the great grandsons, and you can see the Kabbalistic title page here, right? With like this, it's a very mystical image, and they print this beautiful edition as well. And they kind of eventually just settle. These are printed the same year. They basically just settle and say, listen, this is too damaging. And at the same time, other print houses are showing up everywhere. There's one in Chernovitz, there's one in Lemberg, Lvov, there's one in Berlin, which Berlin's interesting because this Christian censor actually introduces in one of the tractates like a whole new passage that basically is like a proof of Christianity added to the Talmud, which is its own crazy story. I don't own one, only for the reason that I just am uncomfortable with owning that because I just feel like it's a little weird. But there's just a lot more competition, and they just kind of put aside their differences. So this is the second Vilna edition, and the Zhytomyr edition, which is kind of like the final edition of the Hasidic print house. And what you notice among these printings from this era, and I'll see if I don't believe either of these has it, but I have another edition that does. So give me a second. This is an edition from Chernovitz in 1841. You might appreciate this. The first volume has a approbation from the Yismach Moshe, so the founder of the Teitelbaum Hasidic dynasty, where he says, this is a great Talmud and I approve of it. And so sometimes the first volume that says that can go for a little bit more. But generally, what Talmuds of this era look like, the Zhytomyr version and the Vilna version are a little bit higher end. Here's kind of what the style of printing looks like. It's really pretty. It's really wonderful. And what it says, I don't know if it's on this page or the next, I can't quite read it, but what it says is, with all the improvements of Slavuta and Vilna. So at that point, Vilna and Slavuta become kind of like, if you want to print a Talmud, you have to kind of pay homage. Historically, that was actually a Talmud called Justiniani's Talmud, which was printed in 1550. So a lot of texts would just claim they're copying that, even though they're not. His edition adds like citations and all these special things that are just so useful that exist in the modern Talmud. So early on, that's what people are turning to. It then becomes Amsterdam after that, where Amsterdam's the place to be because they have the most uncensored print press, because it's a more modern, enlightened city. They have better typesetting. They have better printing tradition. And then I have a volume, actually, I don't know if it's of this edition or the next one, that actually says, I don't have it with me, but it says printed in Amsterdam, and then printed bit Amsterdam, which could mean in Amsterdam or with Amsterdam, kind of, key Amsterdam actually is usually what it says, but the B and the C, really similar letters. And it says in tiny, tiny font, like the tiniest font, letters, and then it says printed in Lemberg or in Frankfurt, wherever it was actually printed, because they want to tell you that. So then by this time it's Slavita and Vilna that become the main one. Now this edition is kind of cool. It's on blue paper, which was like a deluxe edition. Like they'd print a small number on blue paper. This one, it might be hard to see from the lighting of the camera, but it's kind of got a bluish hue to the paper. It's really gorgeous in person. But that was like for collectors, bibliophiles, not really for the average person, and they're kind of scarce. So with that, you have a sense of how that's the beginning of the modern era, right? You have Slavita, Zhytomyr, and kind of the Vilna editions coming together as really central. At the same time, though, I want to point something out, is that this volume is from the same year as the two I just showed you, but there's something different about it, and I can grab the other two and kind of A-B them. But basically, this is from Lemberg in... They do a really nice... This is a really nice Shas. It has this beautiful title page. This one's a little bit damaged. Really intricate,
very
engraving.
Intricate.
And this is, famous title page. If you open up a Shulchan Aruch, they have these title pages because the Lemberg is the basis for the modern one. For most I think for 3 out of 4 of like the main books of Shulchan Aruch. But if I turn, so Sanhedrin, which is what this copy is, and actually what the Zhytomyr copy I have is one of the top tractates that gets a lot of censorship because there's stories about Jesus across it. And one thing that I noticed the first time I opened this version in Lemberg is that you can actually see kind of like the middle ground of censorship, right? Where like censorship is happening, but their Jews are still able to get away with a little bit here and there. So if I open up the book to, let me just get the page here for you, overshots by a couple, where instead of having these big chunks of text missing, they have this little sliver missing. So you can see it just jumps there. And that's to tell you, listen, might not have enough room to write this in, but just know that like it's there, there's something there missing. And they would actually, oftentimes the print houses would sell like supplemental books that they wouldn't put their name on. There'd be no title page. They would basically say, here's all the stuff that the censor forced us to take out. And they couldn't trace it back to the print house directly, and people would have them with them. That's also a danger of studying these old Talmuds, is that sometimes like they're kind of like, you need to know what is changed in them, because you might get stuck on something that it just turns out was a Christian censorship thing or things like that. But you can see very directly. And the Zhytomyr version and the Vilna version don't do that. They just cut it off. Like you can't even tell there's a difference there. So at that point, Zhytomyr and Vilna are actually more censored than some of the other printings that are in circulation. Yet they're becoming kind of the gold standard due to like the number of commentaries often, or in the Zhytomyr case, like the perception that like the family is also incredibly holy, pious Jews printing this, but they also add a lot of good commentaries. Often the reputation is based on commentaries, how many you can fit in the back of the book. And so that's kind of how you begin to see these problems of censorship and errors becoming, less of a focus, and how you get, there's about 100 years, Frida, where once we kind of have a standard version of the Talmud that everyone kind of accepts, where they're still fixing the errors and they're still adding in censorship. So even up until the 80s. And it's a really interesting time. So what I'll show you next is a first edition of the edition that you'll see in every yeshiva today. This is a volume of the Vilna Shas, printed in 1880, the 1880 edition. This one's from 1885 because it takes... Printing the Talmud is never like a one-year thing. But that might be familiar to some of the viewers. This is the first edition. So this is the first time this appears in print. This is the first Vilna Shas as it exists. It is a huge undertaking. It is like a massive, massive achievement in Hebrew printing overall. It's actually printed by the widow and Brothers Rom, who own the print house. The widow is the widow of the previous owner, who really takes control. She's like a very strong leader in the print house, and she says, I'm going to print the best Talmud anyone's ever seen. They go to the Vatican and get manuscripts. Like they sneak in kind of to get manuscripts for this. They go across, they get hundreds of commentaries from modern rabbis to stuff going way back and put it in here. It's just this massive, massive undertaking. And it's really all based on on a mail order system. So you have Jews basically saying, I'll place an order for, this is Bechoros, again, like family law, law of children and redemption of children.
The eldest.
Yeah. And so basically, you might say, I'm going to put an order in for that. You might do it on a subscription basis to get your volumes. And over the course of 6 years, they print this. It's massive undertaking, but 6 years is not that long for printing a Talmud. They tend to range anywhere from a few years for like the really well-financed, really, the one I showed you with had the crazy investment early on, I think takes 3 years. But a lot of the editions will take 15 years, sometimes 20 years. They
So
can be
you're
a
getting
long
them
process.
piecemeal.
You're getting them piecemeal, but they're still designed as sets in most cases. So, the standard, the pagination, right? The font will be the same, and the way in which the text looks and size and the quality of the paper, all these things will be consistent so that you can make a set. But they're not, unless you're going after the print run and they have leftovers, you're not getting a full set. So this is the first edition here, and it's printed by this woman, the widow Rom. But one thing people don't realize about the Vilna edition is it's full of errors. It's really error prone. The first edition, it's a wonderful edition. It's beautiful type, beautiful paper, wonderful commentaries, but there's a lot of errors. And part of the errors is actually Jewish brought in errors. These are not like the Christians saying, we want something about Jesus in here that's positive. This is not the
censors.
Right. So what happens is that to make this happen in 6 years, you have the typesetter. Usually when you prepare a Talmud, you have like a document of the whole text that you're going to, you have a copy of the whole text that you're going to use where you've already established the setting of the type so that people don't have to try and fit these different commentaries in as they're setting each page. They know where all the text goes and just make the process more streamlined and easier and standard. And what ends up happening is they realize, well, if we just have someone reading out loud what that document says to the typesetter, the typesetter can just do it quickly. And so they have, and if you know anything about Yiddish and Ashkenazi pronunciation, there's a lot of variation. And there's also a lot of times where like letters are combined or words are kind of, like, for example, like the T at the end of like, some words will turn to an S, right? Or things along those lines. And so you'll sometimes, given how Hebrew works and Aramaic works, where these are languages which take their meaning from like a 3-letter root or some sort of root that is very short, where a change in one letter completely can change the meaning, where suddenly a T becomes an S or this becomes that because someone misheard. And so, throughout history, I mentioned that there are books published where they say, here's what's censored in our edition of the Talmud. The Vilna edition, the Vilna edition goes one step further, where rabbis begin putting out volumes saying, here's all the errors.
Wow.
So here's, for example, here's an edition of all the errors. If I open up here. So here, this is starting off. This is like in Maseches Shabbos, right? These are the beginning of all the errors. Index of errors. It keeps going. So this is just the same Masechah. It's just going to keep going. And so people ascribe a holiness to the Vilna Shas in the first edition, right? People will say, wow, you have a first edition Vilna Shas. I said, it's super historically cool. Don't study from it. Because it's a little bit, there's so many better, they've fixed a lot of these errors. Oftentimes what would happen when you find errors like this is that a rabbi would write a book like this. The print house, if it was established that these errors were actually errors, they might fix it immediately in the next edition. Or sometimes what the print houses would do is they'd actually append at the end of the book and say, listen, this rabbi thinks there's a lot of errors in here. You can decide for yourself. But that is not as common in the modern world. More often it's, you're getting these supplemental editions. So if I'm reading this, I have to have one of these with me because, you could get caught up on saying that makes no sense. And then you're right. It doesn't make any sense. Someone misread the type or maybe there was an error because they were moving too fast or something along those lines. The Vilna edition is the only edition printed at this point because the widow Rom, as I mentioned, she actually purchases the Slavita house. So she purchases the Zhitomir print house and basically closes it down, takes all the equipment, and now there's no competitors. So now the fight over, we're all claiming that we're printing off Slavita and Vilna turns into, well, now there's just Vilna left. And Vilna is even using the same machinery as Zhitomir anyway. So now there's one print house and they're printing this great edition with tons of commentaries. So the first kind of indication that this is permanent comes with World War I, in my opinion. This is kind of an opinion, but this is where you have more print houses needing to print Gemaras as a result of the war. These are the first 2 Gemaras printed in North America. Okay, so this one here is printed. I'm going to show you here in a second once I get to the title page.
They're the first editions.
First edition. This is printed in 1919 in Canada. by the Orthodox, rabbinic establishment. Because what happens is that at that point, everyone's buying their Talmuds from Vilna. Like everyone. It's just kind of, there are editions, like there's a Barditchev printing, there's, these smaller printings happening, but largely it's coming from Vilna or places printing Vilna copies. And with World War I, you can't get them in America anymore because there's no shipping of these across, the sea. The landscape is devastated. All these things are happening. And so by the time the war's ending, the Jews of America are freaking out and they're saying, we don't have Talmuds. And the Jewish community comes together and they fund their own printing of the Vilna Shas. So they have a full edition. I have a bunch of the volumes here, and it's basically a letter for letter reprint. They might make additions or changes. This one's cool. I'm from Boston. This is printed in 1920 in Boston. It actually says, instead of saying Vilna, it says Boston. I don't know if you can see that. Right. And so at this point, people are really just going with the Vilna Shas. I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. It has so many great commentaries. It's so well organized. The pagination, it hasn't changed, but really they're really created in terms of adding all these extra little bits, on the page that might, help you in your study, like little shortcuts or kind of reference points that have come in over the course of printing. There's kind of a culmination of a lot of these advancements that have been happening over time where they kind of put together and make kind of an ultimate edition. And so, by the time that, World War I's over, this is the edition. This is the one that people are buying. Some older Hasidim and older people, the old generation, have mentioned that the Lemberg volume that I showed you with the Sanhedrin had the gap still. That edition was around a little bit more at the time too, because that was liked, especially because there was like a travel edition that was where they did half the page on each side of the page. So it was easy to read and travel with. But, largely Vilna just overshadows everyone else. And so for the interwar period, that's kind of what you get. Joel Teitelbaum writes a Haskama for a Gemara printed in Hungary in, I think, 1941 during World War II, where he basically says this is all our fault. As we can talk about Joel Teitelbaum and his theology at some point, perhaps later. But, there's a lot of these things happening, and a lot of the major rabbinic figures that people think about tend to be involved in printing. Now, the next major moment in printing is World War II.
What were you saying about him issuing the printing in 1942?
No, 1941, 42, like the early 40s, before Hungary is invaded by the Nazis, when the Jews of Hungary think they're safe, until I'm sure you've heard stories from your childhood or from people in the Hungarian community, but until the Germans invade, the Jews are largely, they're not unaffected, but the effect that they have from the Holocaust is so much weaker. So they're still engaged in Hebrew printing to the last day. Even the Belzer Rebbe comes through Budapest and gives this infamous speech where 2 months before the Nazis invade, saying, with my Ruach HaKodesh, my Das Torah, like my rabbinic kind of miracle work.
Future sight.
My future sight tells me that you will all be fine. And so no one really knew. And so up until the end, things are kind of going on as normal. So throughout, though, they're just reprinting the Vilna Shas, and you can find numerous editions. There's even one in 1939. I don't have one at all, mostly because they're expensive and I'm just not super interested, but coming actually from the town my family comes from in Lithuania. I have a lot of Litvish descent, and that town actually printed a Gemara, and you can see, there's the name of the town, right? And that's kind of cool. But so a lot of towns just start printing, and it was common for towns, for like their local yeshivot, maybe to print small, cheap copies of stuff, or for like their Talmud Torah, whatever, to really get this together. But you really see a more systematization of it, where it's really the Vilna Shas, which is being reprinted, as opposed to maybe a unique layout for the Talmud Torah or the local community, or there's really a sense of, this is it, we're done. Now, with World War II, things begin to change. So the Nazis invade a lot of the centers of European Jewry. They burn Talmuds. They save a few because they're as relics, to say, once the Jews are gone, we'll put this in like a museum as, here's who the Jews were, right? It was an aspirational, very evil type of approach. And so what you find are, during the Holocaust, there's printings by refugees. And then after the Holocaust, they're there's a shortage. So those are two different phenomena, which I can talk briefly about here, which I think speak a lot to kind of the Jewish experience. To start off, I think this one is incredibly cool. So this is tiny. If you see where it's printed, it's in Shanghai. This is printed in 1942 by the Mir Yeshiva. And so for those who don't know, when the Nazis invade Poland, so do the Soviets. And they split Poland in two. And they don't go to war with each other for years. And so a lot of the yeshivot, Chabad and Lithuanian Jews are especially affected by this, either find themselves under the Nazis or under the Soviets. And so most of the people under the Nazis escape to the Soviet side because the Soviets are like the lesser of two evils, but they're still an evil. No one expects the Soviets will invade. I mean, the Nazis will invade the Soviet Union. So no one's really worried about that. What they are worried about, though, are that the communists are cracking down on Jewish practices in yeshivot. You know, you have all these stories of these rebbes who stayed behind in the Soviet Union to keep Judaism alive, whether it's, you know, Skolen or these different, or under the Eastern Bloc, right, who really keep Judaism going in their localities after the Holocaust. But this is happening too before, but especially with the invasion of Lithuania, Estonia, all the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, where a lot of the Lithuanian Jewish population is, who are yeshivish generally, and Poland, which has a major Hasidic population and yeshivish population. You suddenly have all these people who are in yeshivot, all these talmidim, all these rabbis who are now under the Soviet control, where they're trying to crack down on religion. And so basically the orthodoxy, like the standard rabbinic approach to this is, don't try anything. Don't try and escape. Don't leave, because if you try and you fail, you'll be sent to Siberia. And Siberia, you're likely to die. And if you're not likely to die, what are you going to do there? You don't have any of your infrastructure. How are you going to be Jewish? All these other issues. But some people disagree. Among them are this one Chabad yeshiva, I think it's called Tomchei Tamima, something along those lines, along with the Mir Yeshiva, which is kind of like the Harvard of Eastern Europe. It's a huge yeshiva, 400 students, which was massive at the time. And they decide, we're going to give it a shot. They go through the Dutch embassy. It's really interesting. They use the Dutch embassy in Lithuania, who is like, the ambassador is really, really sympathetic. And basically he says, listen, if you want to get out of the Soviet Union without a visa, because the Soviets won't give you one, Curacao is a Dutch colony where technically the governor can approve your entry without a visa. That being said, you still need approval. But what he would write on these kind of exit forms is, to Curacao, no visa required, because there was no visa required. But he doesn't mention that you'd still need approval. So when the Soviets see these documents, they see, oh, he's going to Curacao, which is in the Caribbean. It's, you know, it's kind of a weird place to want to go, like with all these people. And they say, you know what, we'll give them interviews to leave. They sit down with the secret police and they talk to them. Most of them, maybe not most, but a good majority, like 75%, 80% get out this way. Some are stopped because like they're Soviet citizens and they won't let them leave, or there's other complications. Sometimes they want to stay behind with family or friends, but they get out, and they get out through Japan, because the Japanese ambassador, with what seems to be active approval from the Japanese government, says, bring these Jews here. Have them come through us. It's like a very different approach to anti-Semitism. You know, there's not the same type of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic kind of preconceptions in a lot of Eastern, you know, in a lot of East Asia. And so he basically gives them entry through Japan to go to Curacao, which they're not going to Curacao. And they end up in Kobe, Japan, this whole yeshiva, all these hundreds of students, and they end up going to Shanghai, to like what is basically the Shanghai ghetto. It's the Japanese put them all in this ghetto, but it's not a ghetto in the sense that you think about it. It's just that they can only live within this confined space. They're allowed to come and go. There's not really a lot of restrictions on them. It's just that all the Jews should live in this space. And so they live in Shanghai until the 40s, where they all go to the 46, 47, where they all go to the United States and Israel. But this is from when they first arrive in Shanghai, and they realize we're a yeshiva, we need Gemaras. And so they print this tiny Gemara. It doesn't have the title page. they can't afford to print a fancy title page.
Ah,
It's printed on the thinnest paper think
it
I've ever
looks
seen in a
very
book.
thin. Yeah.
It's like newspaper paper, right? It's like tearing, in places and stuff because of how thin it is, and these just fall apart. This is the original binding. It's this very, like cheap. It's basically just cardboard that just has like some tape around the edges and some cloth and things like that. And that's how they printed the Gemara in Shanghai. And so this is when they were studying Maseches Shabbos, and that's how they did it. So these are uncommon. They show up every once in a while, but I just think historically, it's just a very cool moment from the Holocaust. It tells you, at this point, Vilna is so solidified that they have to print the Vilna edition. They think to bring one with them, clearly, or at least some volumes. And that's what they do is they start printing the Vilna Shas, and they eventually start printing them over time. They print a full set's worth in the mid 40s, like 45, 46 ish. That's a little bit different from this. It's a little less crude, but I love this one because of how it really kind of exemplifies the dire escape that they just went through and how kind of desperate they are. The next major World War II moment in printing is when the Allies liberate the camps. Because what you have millions of Jews who survived the Holocaust, and when they go home, they can't go in. Like they don't have a home to go to. Sometimes the village was wiped off the map. Oftentimes they come home if they lived in a major city or major metropolitan area. There's a non-Jew living in their apartments and who says, "Get out of here. This is ours now. We took your stuff." And even at times you have Holocaust survivors going to their hometown and being killed by their Gentile neighbors who say, "Oh, you're still alive? We thought you were killed like the others," and murder them all. There's a few pogroms that happen in the late 40s. So what happens is that the Jews essentially get a status as like a displaced people. Like they don't have a homeland to go to. They don't have anywhere to settle. They can't just send them back to Poland or Lithuania or Romania or Hungary. And so they're stuck in these displaced person camps. And the first thing that they need are books. And the problem is the Nazis burn them all. So what happens is that they find like individual copies of like tractates, of halachic works, of prayer books in like Nazi warehouses, and they start printing them on like newspaper paper that they find in like old anti-Semitic publications that the Nazis were running. So here's an early edition of a Gemara from the displaced person camps from 1946, just after the war ended, and it's on this it's really small, it's really delicate. And one thing, I don't know if the camera will catch this. It's printed, the binding, it's bound and printed on paper that was formerly invoice sheets. So like these are sheets from a business that say like in German, like sale price, like quantity. And like they're just taking any paper they can get and they're printing these. And so you open it up and there's this wonderful note from the committee that printed it in Hebrew, just basically saying like we're printing, here's this Gemara we're printing like through like the American authorities. And then you have, which is my favorite part, the first page of the calendar of the Daf Yomi and Mishnah Yomi following the Holocaust, so that now you can start learning again and you have the whole schedule. And so there's the schedule. In some of these, there's also a prayer for I think this oh no, there's a small prayer here. It's saying like for the memory of, it's really tiny. I don't know if the camera's going to pick up on it, but it's for the remembrance of, those who perished in the Holocaust, and like for the elevation of the souls of those who died. And then it's printed by this, in Germany, and it's got these really simple pages. The font is painfully small, and the paper is painfully thin. I'm really worried sometimes to open this. I don't study from this, but this has to be the smallest Gemara text I own. It's super tiny. And what a lot of these early ones are they found a copy of Tainus, which is like fast days, right? This is what this is. And they found it in a Nazi warehouse, and that's the only copy they have, right? They don't have, if someone says, I want to study marriage law because my wife is probably dead and I don't know what happened to her, which is a really common desire. They want to study halachic issues that arise out of what they just went through. And they can't always get them because they just don't have a volume. So the Americans actually print a full edition of the Talmud in 1946, 47. that commemorates kind of the liberation. It's kind of a propaganda piece in a way, because it's like about, well, the Americans come and restoring the liberties and all these things to the Jews. It has this beautiful image of the concentration camps and the land of Israel behind it, and like yellow. It's like this engraving. I don't have one with me. Actually, I may have access to one shortly that I can send you a picture of the image so that you can show people. But it's this wonderful edition. It's printed based on the second edition of the Vilna Shas. And the reason is because they don't have any editions with them in Europe, and they're able to hunt down a second edition Vilna Shas in New York, and they get it shipped back into Europe, and they use that as the basis for printing this whole Talmud. And they're great photos of the rabbi who's I might have them somewhere, and I can send them to you if I can find them, of the rabbi printing this, where he's looking at these pages. They had to import the pages from, I think, Turkey, like the paper, because they didn't have good enough paper to print this on. And it's this huge process, and there's all these process pictures for it. And it was kind of this achievement. But by the time they actually finish it, everyone's going to Israel or America. There's not really a displaced person camp. And so it largely becomes a memento where famous rabbis are saying, I want one, I want one, I want one. So, you'll often find these come up to market, and they'll have the stamp of a famous yeshiva or rabbi in them. And it's really, and that's usually what, where they went. And they were read. These were considered study books. They weren't considered mementos. I have one more from the camps. This is kind of like a later print from about a year after that one I just showed you, where the binding's a little better. The paper's still incredibly thin, but now you're kind of getting to see, there's a longer prayer in this one, but but you're beginning to see that they're able to print the topics people want. So this is like Yibum, Yivamos. So it's like, if your husband dies and he has a surviving brother, do you have to remarry them? And the ways that there are exceptions and all that stuff, which are for where all these people were murdered, is a very relevant topic. So you see that really coming forward. You also see really early on, so behind me, that's the first edition, I think I mentioned earlier, of the printing right after the Holocaust. So when Hasidim arrive in Williamsburg and they say, I want a Shas in my home now that I'm free from that, they buy what is the Schlesinger Shas, which was printed in New York by a printing press that existed prior to the Holocaust, but kind of ends up serving a lot of the communities that arise. They actually print the first Shas. I don't have any volumes of it because it's kind of they're big, and they're kind of, they're always in a set, and I never want to break up the set. Like I don't want to give someone a partial set of these, and I don't want to hold one of these in my house because they're huge. But they have the first printing of a Shas that has Joel Teitelbaum's commentary in the Talmud. So they do a lot of things to kind of appease the community, but you can kind of see the evolution. And to this day, they're still dealing with what I'm talking about earlier: the censorship, the lack of materials, the lack of funding. So the big moment is Oz V'Hadar publishes this big Talmud that's, I have so many volumes of it around here. Actually, I have a travel edition here right next to me on my bedside, right? Which is, you can see the same title page. It has a Haskama from, I think, the Skverer Rebbe in New Skver. And, it has, a lot of the stuff that you see historically, but you can kind of see how this all comes together. But, they add in all the commentaries. They're dealing with all the censorship. They add in all they take out the Christian stuff, add in the non-Christian stuff that was taken out. And really only with these modern editions do you really see a lot of these problems resolved for the first time. And it's really, I love kind of the throughway that you get with a lot of these books, where it's like you can start at the beginning, you can see the problems they're facing, you can see how people evolve, and you can see how we get here, right? Like how, like a young boy in Lakewood or Williamsburg or in, wherever they may be, is studying from this and how we got from A to B. And I don't know, I love this stuff. This is kind of my bread and butter. I have other Gemaras that are interesting too, but I thought these were like some of the fun ones in terms of the stories or the things that you can tell with them. So yeah, I mean, I've loved collecting Gemaras. I don't have one from every edition, but I have a lot of editions. And as a study tool, they're great. I love opening them up and seeing, oftentimes you get handwritten notes from people where they're saying, oh, here's what I think about this verse. Or it's just some guy, right, who studied this in 1750 or 1800. And you get to see what they were thinking, or you can see that they struggled with the meaning of a certain word because they wrote like a synonym for it, right? Or like something like that, right? Or like they just would write things in the text in the margins. And it's just fantastic. I love that. I will say that studying them, though, again, I mentioned this earlier, you have to be a little careful with the censorship and with the errors. If you buy an old Shas, they often come from Judaica stores for not too much money. And my only my only warning to your listeners or your viewers is that, you might want to be careful, but just in terms of both the Christian censorship and also the errors that we Jews make, and as we try and navigate the whole printing process. Because again, if you look at how big that volume is behind me, it's like,
Yeah.
there's so much text in there, and you're printing these over a few years, you're gonna miss stuff. And so I think it's been edited to death now, and people have preferences about what way of editing they like and what way of restoration they like, etc. So, I have here, like, Mosnaim, which this is a Gemara printed also like a major print house. They put it right back in, the text, as opposed to Oz V'Hadar, which puts on the side as a commentary of here's what was removed. Different approaches, different, folks like different things, and people I've been told by a lot of Hebrew booksellers that people are happy with the different editions available today, that they love, what's available. I think we're living in kind of a golden age of Hebrew printing. You'll see a lot of people like crowdfunding, even, this book was printed by this rabbi who died in the Holocaust and who it didn't get a reprint ever, but the teachings are great, and I want to reignite his memory or something like that. And so we're living in kind of like our own golden age now, which is, for someone who's into these books and who likes it, is really exciting.
One little thing I'm curious about, what you just said about Hebrew printing being in its golden age. Is this like a big market? Do people have the money to spend on so many expensive books? Is this like, I don't actually know the economics happening in this area.
If you mean like the antique ones, no. I mean, they're not always as expensive as people assume, but they're not cheap either. Like, you can probably buy a whole Shas or whole Gemara set for the price of one of these volumes I showed you. So they're not economical to buy. But today, you could get, for example, this travel Talmud, right, which is beautiful print. It's smaller, but it's nice. It's, I think, $140, $150 at retail. Which is not no money, but in the grand scheme of things, is not crazy. A lot of the Gemaras too tend to be a little subsidized. I mean, that's a historic thing too, where some of the books that were considered more holy, like a Gemara, like the print houses might publish like a Christian text or a Latin text in order to gain more profits to make the Gemara cheaper. So that I think they still kind of do that today a little bit with some of the printings that they do, where they try and kind of offset some of the costs for these bigger book sets by, with other things. But, I don't work at, Oz V'Hadar or Art Scroll or the different printing houses. So I can't tell you what they're actually doing, but I can tell you that, for example, like the text that we have, like the printing, like the quality of type is, better than what we had in Europe, right? Like the quality of a lot of aspects of this are better than what we
like
had
the
in Europe.
Clarity of the letters. Is that what you mean?
This is a horrible example because it's so tiny, but here, this one's a little bit bigger. This might give you a better, I don't know if it gives you a real A-B sense, but you can at least see the letters are pretty crisp. And so there's a lot of, and those aren't I can't give anyone legal advice. I'm into law, but typesets are typically not copyrightable. So I think once people start innovating and making clearer type, everyone kind of benefits. So yeah, but overall, I don't think, they make editions now. Back in the day, a lot of these would be huge volumes or folio size because historically the size of the book correlated with the importance of it. So if you see in like medieval texts, you'll have like a Bible that's like, bigger than my head. And then you'll have, a little law book that's like this big, right? And they're both made by the same scribe. But so typically the Gemaras tended to be bigger. Now they've come up with a wider range of sizes and cost of entry points. So you can get, like a 10-inch Gemara for a few $100, a 12-inch for a few $100 more. You can get the big ones for, even a little bit more than that. But that's, again, going to be specialized. Really, why these are so big now, though, is less about the history of printing and more about marketing. If I have to be honest, the widow Rome, when she printed the Vilna Shas, wanted to make like the most deluxe edition, so that when you married off when you were a wealthy man marrying off your daughter, if you bought your son-in-law anything but a Vilna Shas, you were a cheapskate, right?
I see.
It's like the finest edition. It was like it cost like 3 times more than the other editions in the fine edition, where she uses higher quality paper and a little bit more fancy things here and there, and so that largely comes out, into like the chassan and kala culture, which is its own contentious topic of who pays for costs and the increased cost of weddings. The number of announcements I see from prominent rabbis about this makes my head spin at times. So, but this is one of those things that comes out of like the kind of chassan kala culture of like you buy the chassan like a big shas that's so big that even when he's, God willing, 120 years old, sitting at his desk, and he can't see like an inch in front of him, he can still read the big print.
I see.
My sight isn't great, so I love that. But it's like it's really it's kind of a marketing thing a little bit, but it's also like it's meant like in the same way people will have like a Shulchan Aruch in their house or these other books just to show that they're Orthodox Jews. It's like a cultural thing too. Like oftentimes the thing that I see is that people will have these books in their house and they won't read them. There's actually a big phenomenon with this market where a lot of the prices are being driven up by wealthier Haredi Jews who don't have anything else to spend on, but like Sforum and religious articles who want like a holy book in their house. And there's so much we can go into with that. That probably is better for a discussion on Joel Teitelbaum and some of those things if we do have one. But the reality is that a lot of those benefits tended to come from people who read the books. Like if you read the rabbis who say that these benefits exist, they're saying if you own this printing of the Talmud and you read it in your house, like if you otherwise you have a warehouse full of books. Like that's what Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky said about it, right? There's like a lot of discourse around this, and it's very interesting. But so people are investing in these. I don't know how long that investment will last, whether it's like a current trend, whether it's going to go away. But you see also people paying at auction. I've seen it myself, people paying 10 times the market value for a book because it's being auctioned in Kiryas Joel versus being auctioned by like a very well-established very well-established rare book auctioneer. And I think to myself, wow, this book just went for 10 times as much, then I can go out and buy it now from that other person, right? So it's, sometimes you look at this stuff and you think, okay, it's a little bit, I think part of it's like, I think most of it's a status thing, right? Of being able to say like, I have this holy book in my house when they have this Forum bookshelf, this Forum Shtib with all the leather bound things, and it's like a nice centerpiece for like near the Shabbos table or wherever they're putting in, where people who visit can see. And I'm not so much into that. I like the books for the books, and I prefer to read them and to enjoy them as books. But it's becoming more of a thing and more of a cultural moment, and I'm happy to go into that more at some point too, if that's of interest. But people are investing in these, and they do buy them. Oftentimes, though, you can get a good deal. Like if you want one of these big ones, like a Chassan size shas that's well printed, you can get a used one for $100, $200, $300. They're readily available.
Each volume.
No, the set.
The whole set?
the whole thing. Yeah. You can get them for pretty affordable if you know where to look. Sometimes you might have to, the most I've seen them go for, I paid a little extra for the two I have there. That one's just particularly nice. And that one those are paper book sleeves which everyone threw out, right, when they bought it, because it looks like the one on top when you remove the sleeve, which is more traditional looking. And I think people prefer that in their house. That looks a little bit more kind of modern, reform, reconstructionist-y.
Yeah, that's so true.
Which is funny because I actually see, I saw an ad in, I think, Devar Yoim the other day where it was like, it had a picture of this set with those covers. And I thought, I don't think I've ever seen a Hasidic house where they still had the covers on.
Yeah, no.
So it's, they all came with covers initially, but almost everyone threw them out. I do have one edition from the 50s of this where it has like a pleather cover, which is a little bit nicer. It's somewhere in one of my bookshelves, but it's largely they remain the same. But most people don't want them because, take it from me as someone who has these, like you can see this big industrial shelving here. They're impossible to store. They're impossible to store, and they become more of a headache than a benefit unless either it's like the most affordable option or you're really into them, and I'm just really into them. So I'm willing to go out and assemble a Home Depot like 500-pound shelf that can hold hundreds of pounds and can adjust to over the 17-inch size of these books. I mean, they're really massive in person. I can't. I'm at law school and I walk around these books sometimes, and I'm like, I must look ridiculous carrying this massive book that's like makes me look like a little ant or something, given like the proportions. It's just ridiculous. So there's a culture that a lot of this stuff's accessible, I think, for the most part. I mean, if you got to think, like, for example, the Slavuta house, which is like the most, or Slavita is how it's said in Yiddish. They're the most valuable Gemaras that you can get from like the Hasidic and like Orthodox perspective, and generally, and they're super common on the market. They go for a lot of money, but the Slavita house, a third of their print output was Gemaras. So these were such prominent books. Like once a print house printed these sets, they wanted to capitalize on them, so they would often reissue tractates as demand came up, and so they're not as uncommon as I think people might expect. I think they're uncommon at times because of the history and the circumstances. Like Salonika, for instance, is a city in Greece that had a long printing history. We have almost no Gemaras from Salonika, despite knowing of probably like a dozen editions, because that city was plagued with fires constantly, where the city burned down like sometimes year after year, where like the whole city was leveled and they had to rebuild. I think it had to do with the location or something about, what they were using to build their houses. But this happened for a couple hundred years, where basically we only have fragments or a few individual volumes from that city because it just kept burning down and they were lost. So, but for the most part, this stuff you can find. It's out there. It's really cool and interesting. I love it. They're a pain in the butt to keep store. They are falling apart. The binding's crumbling. I'm going to have to, probably dust and vacuum and clean up after this because of all like the little binding chunks that are falling off, because you have 400-year-old binding doesn't tend to do so well. People weren't thinking, oh yeah, some guy in 2025 is going to be opening this and discussing it and across the table. But I do love kind of that sense. And I love the process too of having to navigate in the old way of saying, okay, well, that seems odd. Is that censorship? Is that just a difficult passage?
Yeah.
Is that, and how to navigate these things and being able to recognize, this is how people did it, hundreds of years ago. And sometimes you can even tell what rabbi is reading what edition based on what commentary is available or what mistakes he's making. Because sometimes the mistakes he'll repeat in his citations or this or that. And to Joel Teitelbaum, he had a lot of great scholarship in his lead up to his books, where he really just was going through book after book. And there are some, for example, where he cites where we don't really have attestations for that original version. There are Jerusalem Talmud volumes that we know are lost because the Rambam quotes them, but we don't have them anymore. Like whole masechtas, like on like a topic that are gone from history. There's a famous forgery of that, in fact, from Eastern Europe, where a guy shows up in the 1800s saying he has the missing Yerushalmis. They're so well forged that basically every major rabbi believes them. And then they find out within a few years that they're all forgeries, they're all fake, and they have to recall them. I don't own them, only for the fact that I'm deathly afraid that someone comes into my house or inherits my collection and they don't know this is a forgery. So
you should leave a note. You should add your own signature.
Maybe I'll get one and rebind it and have it say, forged Yerushalmi or something like that. So people really know. But I'm just a little hesitant with some of that stuff. Like I don't have the tractate Shabbos from Berlin, where they add a whole passage about why Jesus is king and Messiah, or like, things like that, where it's such an obvious kind of gross thing. And it's more of a personal preference, and everyone has their own collecting style and way of doing things. That's just mine. But I love this stuff. I have a huge passion for it. My parents think I'm nuts when I see how many oversized packages I get in the mail and how I'm having to jump through hoops to store this stuff, which is its own. I have multiple bookshelves just around this room just filled with sforim. This is just the Gemaras, right? We're not getting into the Shulchan Aruch.
Can we see the room at some point? Or is it?
Maybe it probably have to be a little cleaner because it's.
Can you send a picture later?
I'll send a picture later because I have all these Gemaras strewn about across the whole room.
That's what I want to see.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, you can. Yeah, once I get them back on the shelves, it's more that they're right now. It's like everything. It looks like a bomb went off, and the Gemaras kind of peppered themselves across the room, so I could show them all to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam. It was absolutely so delightful. We're going to talk more.
Yeah, I'm sure.